I watched over 24 hours, 8 episodes, and 10 bonus films that aren't even directly related to Star Wars, just so I could break down and analyze every last fight scene in Disney's The Acolyte. While my interest in the franchise may have died with Luke in The Last Jedi, and you can bet your ass we're gonna cover those fights one day too, I still couldn't help but be intrigued at the idea of a pre-prequel era Star Wars set to the tone of classical wuxia and mohawk films. But despite showrunner Leslie Headland and the cast hyping up all of the action and character drama, as well as listing a ton of inspirational films, which I felt the need to watch every single one, just to see if they were telling the truth. The Acolyte still managed to suffer from a bunch of lukewarm reception and rumors of cancellation. But was it really worth it in the end? Are these truly the best fights that Star Wars has ever put to screen? Join me as we bow in and analyze every fight scene in The Acolyte Season 1. The Acolyte wastes no time getting through the intro and immediately giving us the showrunner's influences on full display. Unfortunately, when May, played by Amanda Stenberg, steps up to throw down with Trinity, this first bit of stance work looks like something out of Overwatch. You're not Genji, girl. What are you trying to do here? The dialogue doesn't help with the cheesiness either, and I'll be honest, even though I actually appreciate her shoutouts to similar scenes in various Mohawk and samurai pieces, the opening lines make Devil May Cry here feel less like an assassin and more like an edgy poser.
I have no quarrel with you.
Attack me, Jedi.
I only bring it up because when designing characters, how they move and fight is just as important as what they wear when it comes to blending with their written personalities. But now we get to the opening fight scene itself by having May initiate the brawl by kicking this poor dude's barrel out from underneath him and stomping him in the face. From here, this alien that I'm not gonna bother to research grabs her shoulder only to be paid back by getting his arm locked over and back-fisted. But pay attention to how she holds onto his hand. She's got a grip on his coat here. And as I'm demonstrating here, I can't pull him off if he's actually got a hold of me. You're supposed to go over the hand and grab the backside of the palm so you can strip the grip and then go into your lovely little back fist combo. Thanks, bro. Shoutouts to my roommate, much love for being my temporary mukjong here. 2 problems with this. For one, she did the reversal wrong. Let's just ignore for a moment the cliche shoulder grab that does nothing in the fight anyway. Like, what even was your plan, guy? Instead, I want you to focus on how she grabbed the guy's arm. Despite performing the technique wrong, I actually kinda like the flow of the movements they chose here, especially with the back fist. But rather than continue the Wing Chun influenced trapping, for some reason they decided to choreograph it to where May reached back across with the same hand she just back-fisted with and used that to do the head slam. It looks a little clunky because it is. Personally, I think they should have leaned into Wing Chun a bit more, and instead of going here and then reaching across to do that same motion, she should have gone here, swapped hands, and then grabbed with this hand to do the slam. Not only would that sequence have ended up with a much stronger positioning, but it would have maintained that sense of Chinese martial arts, while also, more importantly, maintaining the tempo of the fight. But the more important issue, and this is a recurring problem with a lot of these earlier fights, is that all of the movements look too stiff. All of them are queued up way too much, almost like they're scared to go faster, you know what I mean? Funny thing is, if they had gone just a bit quicker here, then the improper technique wouldn't have been nearly as noticeable. The preceding segment has May dodge some attacks from all these jobbers, and I want you to notice here, there's no physical contact happening between her and the horny guy taking a swing. But for some reason, they added a sound effect anyways. She clearly dodged the punch, guys. Why did you use that sound effect? From here, she parries another guy out of the way just in time to duck under a haymaker. And I gotta tell you something, even though I personally believe that choreographing somebody to duck under a haymaker is one of the least creative, laziest choices you could make, I am a huge fan of her ducking and striking at the same time. It's very Bruce Lee, and it does help give a more martial flair to it. Sadly, May ends up missing the timing on her push kick. As you can clearly see, when she goes to parry the move, it's already well out of the way. The next motion is then this weird elbow strike that I think is supposed to be hitting somewhere in the neck, followed up with a poorly framed back fist that clearly shows she didn't hit her target with her actual hand. He then proceeds to clean this guy up using a poorly executed table toss with absolutely no hip follow through in the movement. From here though, we get a fantastically performed force-powered sidekick that has some lovely practical effects and wire work in it. But this, pun intended, is what kicks off all of the force usage in this scene. And don't you worry, I'm going to cover why that's a bit of a problem when we get to the end of the fight. The following segment gets rough when Mei ducks under a man lunging for her and then kicks somewhere in what is without a doubt the worst choice of the choreography so far, before transitioning her target into a gross over-the-shoulder reverse guillotine. Notice the continuity error when we cut to the horn guy fiddling with his stuck blaster and then back to Mei, where we see they are in a position they could not have been in without the capture dude having some kind of opportunity to get away. So did they just change the choreography and cut the wrong takes together? I don't know. Regardless, Mei wraps up the mooks by flipping a table that almost looks like it changes size, and then force teeping it into the gunslinger. So now, it's time to take the gloves off when Jedi Master Indara joins the fight, and we get some nice Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon homages. Even though the obvious comparison is with the bar fight from Crouching Tiger, I think this battle for the saber as a whole has more movements reminiscent of the night chase for the Green Destiny. So, let's go over the play-by-play. Mei throws a wonderfully executed hook kick into a palm kick before lunging with a punch and parrying what I'm assuming is supposed to be a grab from Indara. Can't really tell from this angle. And regardless, not really a good choice to be honest. But it gets even sloppier when Mei comes back with another back fist that Indara guards using Tonsao, before slipping another cowboy punch. And I don't know if any of you guys know this, but ducking under a cowboy punch or a haymaker, whatever you want to call this kind of move, is just one of the laziest things you can do in choreography, and that's why the best fight scenes don't do that. Anyways, after Indara blocks another reach for her lightsaber using Hunsao, I guess Mei decides, I'll try spinning, because that's always a good trick, right? And unfortunately, that's not the only Anakin comparison we're going to make with this show. Unfortunately, Beyblading didn't work for Mei, and the two break apart, with our assailant reaching for one of her concealed knives while Indara lowers her hood and closes in. Taking the initiative, Mei whips out a wild back fist that misses before transitioning into another one with her left hand. Indara blocks again, and in my favorite part of the fight so far, Mei uses her right hand to pin Indara's elbow into her side so that she can spin the hidden knife around and go for a thrust. Gotta say, trapping the elbow is Wing Chun and Filipino martial arts 101, and I think it's a great representation here. Yet again though, the fight hits another hiccup when Indara uses the force to stop the knife. And I know what you're all thinking. I promise I'm gonna cover that soon. But we have got to get through the rest of the scene first. From here, Mei switches hands, and that's a cute little choreography choice, but unfortunately the stab just ends up getting caught by Indara again. Not one to give up apparently, Mei tries to go for another swing at Trinity's gut, only for the hand to be caught and then twisted around, forcing her into a admittedly pretty silly lock. Yeah, if you want to be critical, the way Indara caught the fist would not have been able to stop the blow like that, and her just giving into the twisting is a little weak, but we're very close to the end, so bear with me. Mei uses a tricker-style aerial and swipe with the knife in order to get away and escape to the top of the bar, where she then holds a random patron hostage. Now I can't tell if this is wirework or CGI, but it's a little floaty for my taste regardless. However, at least Indara's pursuit looks a lot better and closer to the stuff we'd see in Hidden Dragon. Isn't it wild how a foreign film that was made over 2 decades ago still has more consistent wirework than a production funded by one of the most wealthy companies on the planet? After rescuing the patron from a fall, Indara closes in on Mei again, who then employs the classic sneaky character technique of hiding behind an object and jumping out to attack way too early. Not a lot to say about this bit, besides that Mei just kinda looks like she's flailing around while Indara nonchalantly evades. However, I will give them credit that the movements are well done, and both the editing and flow of the choreography is nicely timed. Only part I'm not a big fan of is the front handspring, because that wouldn't have done shit if it actually hit anything. From here, this bit moves on to Indara catching a kneeling sidekick for trying to close in, and evades a kick before remembering that she has the force again to stop Mei in the middle of this shit does not look cool. For one thing, What are you trying to stab? Your knives are pointing in The knives are pointing in two different directions. And two, this show was marketed as Star Wars but with more kung fu. So why are you doing stuff like this instead of grabbing real poses from actual martial arts? Especially since one of your characters is using Filipino Kali and Eskrima, the most prolific knife fighting system in the world. Man, knives always make things complicated, and the more of them you have, the more you gotta watch out how you're choreographing them. Case in point, the next exchange. Mei swipes at Indara's head, but rather than using the momentum to flow into a low thrust, she just cowboy swings with her left hand instead. If you're paying attention to this, the knife hand, which is framed towards the audience, is just doing nothing here until she gets spun around. I guess I'll give them some credit. If they were trying to characterize Mei as a spinner, they are doing a good job here. I just think the choices are a little lazy. Anyways, when Mei finally remembers that, oh yeah, she's got a knife in both hands, she goes for yet another stab, which Indara then parries and turns into the same lock she got hit with earlier. Now, while there is a handful of Wing Chun trapping going on here, Indara is sadly a little too rigid to make it look nice, and it's really noticeable when you're paying attention to their hands, as Indara is usually seen giving a full grip to all of her reaches, as opposed to just closing the hands over and guiding more gently, which is more iconic of Chinese trapping. It's genuinely not that bad at all though, because we can tell as an audience how rigid the character kind of holds herself, and it is very important to keep in mind the context of their motivations. Indara is not trying to kill her here, she's trying to subdue her and get answers, which is very important to keep in mind when you analyze fight scenes. It's not just about what looks cool, it has to flow from the motivations of the character. And that's why I will always prefer character-driven action over anything else. At this point in the brawl, I feel like the choice to make Indara focus on mainly evading while only using one arm to fight not only weakens the flow, but also the choreography choices. This is highlighted by having Mei throw a swipe that doesn't even come close, then taking the momentum and using it to stab again, as I suggested earlier. And Indara blocks with one arm before evading two more stupid-looking attacks. Like, what even is this first movement here? It's not all bad though, and one thing I really want to compliment here is their attention to footwork. Because Indara is stepping in with this boxing cover, she's allowing the knife to pass through and enabling her to clear it underneath before having to step out of the way of a follow-up attack. Finally, Indara dodges yet another feral swing before closing in and allowing the knife to get trapped past her shoulder. Then in the lock, she is able to kick the left-hand blade out of Mei's hand before disarming the primary one using the force. I still wish she would have grabbed the meat of the palm here for the reversal, but I love the way they framed the force disarm. Sadly, the rest of the fight is just lame in comparison, as Mei simply pushes Indara away and resorts to throwing the knives. Of course, this fails when Indara whips out the lightsaber and destroys the blades midair. Despite a really solid ult stance, Indara inevitably dies when Mei throws a blade at one of the bystanders, forcing the Jedi to catch it and giving the assassin just enough time to lodge her final knife in her target's chest. Okay, now that the only fight in episode 1 is wrapped up, it is time to address the invisible elephant in the room, the Force itself. Every time the Force pops up in this fight, it will invariably lead to some people in the audience asking, why didn't you just do that before? And to be fair here, this has been a problem with Star Wars since episode fucking 1. We have yet to hear one throwaway line in any of these shows from any of these writers about why the Force can't be spammed in a fight. When all it would take is just one person to acknowledge that, and all of these problems would disappear. And I'll tell you why that is. Because the Force is always written like a plot device, when it really needs to be treated like a character itself. Why is Indara able to capture somebody mid-fall, but not stop Mei when she's in the middle of her wirework jumps? Or how about explaining why she's able to yank a knife out of her hands, but not hold her down? I was really hoping this would have been the one show to point that out, but no. Then you pair that with an audience that may have been unimmersed right away by the opening lines in this episode, as well as the clunky setup, and every time you show the Force in these fights, you're actively hurting it. However, that was not only the first episode, but also the first scene of the show, and despite my hangups, I think it was perfectly serviceable. There's some genuine flashes of brilliance in there, but I personally think that if you're gonna advertise The Acolyte as a wuxia Star Wars series, you may want to throw out all of the wild swings and incorporate some more authentic martial arts. Anyways, on to episode 2. Revenge/Justice opens up very similarly to episode 1, with Mei awkwardly asking a Jedi to attack her. As you may have guessed for plot purposes, he ain't moving right now. So there's not really a lot of fighting to discuss here, but there is some cool stunt work that's being done, and I can talk about that real quick. All of these movements are pretty well performed, especially the wall swipe that she tries at the end. Haven't seen that one in quite a while, really good touch. However, there is a much better action sequence we can talk about, and that is the confrontation between Mei and Sol. Unfortunately, this fight opens terribly. The very first exchange in this fight scene has glaring continuity errors in it. Starting right at the beginning when Mei is visibly going for a cheat step, spinning around vertically, only to cut to her inverting and doing a rise instead, complete with a falling sidekick, which cuts again to the sidekick rising up into the frame instead of from the top. That is such a colossal oof, guys. How did you do this? I don't know whether to blame the choreographer or the editing team, but jeez. You wanna know what the funniest fucking part about that trick is? The rise is a basic move. So why bother with wire work when you could have just gotten a double to do it? And just look at this posing afterwards. Come on, guys. The wire work only gets worse when we see Mei fly like 15 feet into the air while throwing a Fei Long kick while Sol ducks out of the way. I'm beginning to wonder if they only had one take for these because Mei is way over yanked in the harness, and I don't see how you can watch this back and say it's fine. To further my theory, when we move on to the next segment, the way Mei and Sol are framed shows just how far away she is aiming at him. And it's not like the choreography is stepping up either, as all she has been doing is throwing wild-ass cowboy punches while Sol is repeating the same aloof evasions that Indara did. I do, however, love this tempo break when Sol grabs Mei's wrist, only for her to clear the grip wonderfully and execute a spinning hook at the same time. That was a pretty good change-up in the fight's pacing. Annoyingly, Mei opens up the next bout with another front sweep again, and reaches for the lightsaber but catches a knee for her trouble. I really approve of the choice to knee her hand, but the follow-up blows where she's just kind of flailing again kind of makes it hard to enjoy. That is until Sol tries to spin her right round, only for Mei to cleverly break the grip using an outside crescent kick. Another reach for the lightsaber sees Mei being punished by another bite from Sol's knee, which damages her hand long enough for Sol to pull her around and into an Aikido lock. Even if I'm not a big fan of Aikido at all, I still love when a character is assigned a specific methodology of fighting, as long as they keep it consistent. Don't go showing me that one character is using Kali the whole time, only to turn around and make them do Hungar. Foreshadowing. Another cool note is that as Mei tries to swing at the Jedi and break free, Sol is fighting with his eyes closed. After this quick break, Sol puts Mei through another Aikido blender, sending her tripping over and simultaneously robbing the assassin of her weapons. Then after dissing her teacher, Mei closes in with a Webster axe kick that looks pretty good, and we transition to more infighting. Sadly, all of these choreography choices here are pretty weak, because Mei has numerous opportunities to just deck this old fart in the face. Instead, opting to spin around, trying to throw a kick that she had no business attempting at that close of a range. Further, because the creatives in charge of the show seem to think that hands down equal badass and cool, Sol is reduced to awkwardly shuffling around like an armless Steven Seagal. Granted, his motivation is not to just whoop the dog shit out of this woman, he's trying to just subdue her and talk her down out of her anger. Problem is, we already saw that from Indara in episode 1, so we're getting not only repeats of the same motivation, but repeats of the same movements. We wrap up the fight when Sol spins Mei around before hooking her arm and using that leverage for a force-powered throw. Then, at the last second, he catches her using the force, which just begs the question of why he bothered with the throw to begin with. Then the rest of the episode continues with more back and forth arguing as well as some playful usage of the Force. The highlight of which, to me, is Mei escaping using the Force to create a dust cloud. I think that was actually pretty clever. But I can't help but voice my annoyance when Best Boy Yord force pulls a knife out of her hand while she's a good distance away. Writers, why do you do this? What was the entire point of this fight if everybody could have just held her in place together? And more importantly, how does this happen in the writing process? Fight scenes need to be dramatic and cool and whatever else, but they should also serve a story. And it's up to you as the creatives in charge to set them up in a way that doesn't cause obvious issues in plot progression. As far as this fight is concerned, they accomplished nothing besides Mei and Osha seeing each other, and the entire scene could have been replaced by having Yord and Sol just hold her in place with the Force. Until they reveal her sister alive, which gives her the emotional drive she needs to break their grip and bail. The funny thing to me is that all of these issues with the Force have been obvious to the audiences for years, but apparently never dawns on the actual people writing these stories. Ultimately, Episode 2's action scenes seem to lean further into the weaker sides of Episode 1. But I want to make something clear here, especially since there are some definite highlights on the way. Just because I think Episode 1 was passable and Episode 2 is below average, doesn't mean the actors are to blame here. A lot of the problems with these fight scenes could have been fixed in the edit or by just having another take. For the most part, the performers involved are nailing it. Let's go ahead and move on to Episode 3, where there's not exactly any fight scenes, but there are little moments of action that deserve a mention. For starters, even though I'm not analyzing the characters or the story outside of the context for the fight scenes, I will say they may have taken the whole wizards in space joke with the Jedi a little too far with these witches. And also, even though it's not a bad aesthetic at all, I personally feel they lean a little too hard into the Western interpretation of pagan witches instead of the Eastern ones. Beyond that, I also feel like the writing is incredibly contrived to get all of these story beats to happen in this episode. And let's be real here, 90% of the conflict in this episode could have and should have been avoided. But that's not even the biggest issue to me. How they're using the forces. That shit looks like a Hadouken. This may well be the most blasphemous thing I ever say on this channel, but might be time to take a cue from the video games and start adding visual effects to when people use the Force. Because, I'm sorry, all of these different scenes with people using the Force like it's a Kamehameha paired with nothing but a sound cue just ain't cutting it for me anymore. I feel like that sound cue is a way of cheating the audience with what they're actually looking at. You could add that sound bite to anything and it would make it more dramatic. See? Case in point. Tell you what else I think is super dumb. The mom is trying to demonstrate how the power of 2 is better than the power of 1 to the daughters. She beats them anyway. You couldn't have had the mom take an L just for the sake of proving her own point? Outside of the Force stuff, though, there's not really a whole lot to talk about when it comes to the action, and unfortunately, it's the same thing with Episode 4. Unless you count bug murder. But seeing as how Episode 4 ends with setting us up for a huge showdown, I see no harm in skipping directly to Episode 5, where we watch the first encounter between, spoilers, Qimir, and Sol's team. And holy shit, does Episode 5 pop off! Don't get me wrong, they still try to pull some visual shenanigans to mask a few dumb choreography choices, like Yord here just running to the side of the stranger. But for the most part, this episode is a colossal step up. In the first bout, I love how Yord is kicked away, giving the Sith time to parry a swipe, cut this guy's leg out of frame, and then stab him through the chest, all while flowing quite nicely. However, you'll have to forgive the back and forth cause this show seems to enjoy going from high points to low ones, because this bout here between the stranger and the yellow and blue saber jobbers has way too much space between the moves. Yellow saber guy is particularly poorly choreographed, as he blows 2 opportunities to strike in lieu of flourishing his saber like a jackass, which gives the Sith time to short out blue saber using one of his gauntlets, and then take a strike directly to the dome in order to short out the yellow one. Despite the setup they used being lackluster, I love the idea of his armor shorting out the weapons as well as Yord rushing in to protect the blue saber. The quick bout between Yord and the Sith looks pretty good too, with great usage of the environment to cover up the weaker parts of the choreography, such as when Yord is clearly not putting pressure on this lock here. I also love the usage of an Eskrima windshield block that transitions into a number 12 strike and lets Qimir cut Yord's leg. but considering how weak that little slash looks, as well as factoring in what happens to Yord later in the episode, I really think they should have gone even harder here and just cut his leg off entirely. Despite the rapid flow and the wonderful pacing of the fight thus far, we unfortunately have to get to my least favorite bit of this bout when Qimir turns his attention to the 3 Jedi mooks. This initial movement is fantastic and is a legitimate technique in HEMA where you allow a parry to roll your weapon over into a follow-up strike. It just bums me out that instead of rolling over and going for the hand or the body, he just slaps the sabers back down again. We've already seen him do this twice now in the fight, so when he continues to repeat the same choreography, not only does it feel repetitive to the audience, but it also turns into needless movement like the prequels are accused of. It also doesn't help when he baseball bats this one guy away just so he can get into another 2v1 with the same pair that Yord saved earlier. Once again, this dude with the yellow saber here conveniently fails to take any advantage of the openings he's being given. Whether it's swiping at the Sith while he's busy fighting the blue saber, or just lobbing the goddamn legs off when the idiot throws a kick at that range. Regardless of whatever choice they went with, it all ends the same way, right? With blue saber getting parried once more so that Qimir can cut down the yellow lightsaber guy. Speaking of blue, I'm not fond of how obviously far away from her opponent she is swinging here, which of course leads to the Sith giving her a fatal stab through the torso too. And to complete my trifecta of disapproval, the Sith whips out a force pull on the final Jedi, yanking him into his outstretched lightsaber, and making a paired jobber shish kebab as the camera conveniently pans around a tree while Qimir decapitates them. Don't get me wrong, this is visually really damn cool, but it goes back to the same problem with all of the Force stuff. Why didn't you do that the entire time? Speaking of creative choices, I know the showrunner said this episode was inspired partially by Predator, but I personally see more of an inspiration from both the Vader hallway massacre in Rogue One, as well as the bamboo forest fight from A Touch of Zen. By the way, if you haven't seen that second one, go check that shit out. The only issue here is that despite using similar choreography choices and camera work, it still doesn't capture the brutality of those original fights. From here though, everything starts to pick up again as Qimir no-sells a shot from the stun gun, and then we move on to the next part of the battle. Starting with a bang! Sol immediately deflects Qimir's saber throw while commanding Osha and Yord to get to the ship so he can handle this guy himself. Nice slasher villain nod, by the way. Right off the bat, we keep the choreography solid by having character-consistent wrist rolls from Qimir while maintaining Sol's patient redirection and defense. I can't stress enough how much I love how the creators have managed to transition Sol's proclivities from hand-to-hand fighting into armed combat, while playing it off of Qimir's Kikuchiyo-inspired movements from Seven Samurai. In fact, Manny Jacinto himself, the guy who plays our Sith boy here, has listed off his inspirations for the character as being Captain Jack Sparrow, Jackie Chan's Wong Fei Hung, and, as I mentioned before, Mifune's Kikuchiyo from the Seven Samurai. And yeah, now that I've said it out loud, you can totally see it, right? Although I personally wish they maintained some of his jovial attitude from when he was undercover, this is probably the most interesting Sith character we've had in a long time, at least in my eyes. So while Qimir and Sol get ready for another bout, we cut over to Mei getting the shit drop kicked out of her by Jecki. That's what the hell I'm talking about. After a few lukewarm, wild-ass hammer fists from Jecki herself, Mei slips through and hits X-23 with a Seiyo Nage, Dima, which the assassin uses to roll the two of them over and snatch the Padawan into a headlock. Without missing a beat, Jecki rolls them out of it and force pushes Mei through a door. Then, as Mei recovers, she is spun around via the Force and handcuffed. I gotta say, this is all wonderfully shot and filmed, and the performers maintain solid execution, after the first 3 moves at least, alongside creative choreography choices that leads to a nice breaking point for the action. I'm also especially fond of all of the environmental effects, with the falling debris and all of the dust getting kicked up as the two throw down. While Jecki tries to finish cuffing Mei, the latter ends up pulling the Padawan to the ground and whipping out the knives, forcing Jecki to try and get some distance. A nice note to add here is Jecki losing her coat. Write this one down. Damage to a character's clothing or well-being is a great way of subconsciously telling the audience that these characters are at genuine risk in the story. And that aspect of choreography has been missing from Star Wars for quite some time. So it's nice to see it in any amount here. And speaking of damage, we get a lovely callback to Mei's proclivities towards misdirection when she sets up Jecki the same way she did in Dara, by throwing a knife one way and using that to mask a follow-up blow, this time it being a sidekick that knocks Jecki through the walls of the building. And from here, the episode's going to be bouncing back and forth between these two bouts, so for now, it's time to check back in with Sol and Qimir. I love how the Jedi is continually pushing his opponent back with powerful yet focused and controlled swings. I need you all to note the distinct lack of overextension from Sol's attacks here. That's good character work. Qimir then counters by spinning under the lock and reversing their position so that he now has leverage to drive the Jedi back. And at least from where I'm splitting, I think this little bit of choreography is enough to show the audience that maybe Qimir's the one who gave Mei her habits for spinning. And while we're at it, he's probably the same one who taught her the cringy anime posing. And speaking of which, we cut back to Sol in the middle of being on the back foot against Qimir, having to dodge a leg swipe and then two thrusts that make me wish we had a bit more fencing in this show. From here, we get even more of Qimir's favorite wrist-rolling technique, which is very Filipino Kali if I do say so myself. More on that later. That movement then sets up Sol for a spinning side kick, which ends up knocking him away. While Sol is busy getting to his feet, the stranger dips out and the camera checks back in with the students. Despite being backed against a tree and thrown into a lock at knife point, a movement which looks like she willingly put herself into, Jecki breaks free with a headbutt and then hits Mei with a lovely judo slam, complete with full extension on her leg and getting a beautiful shape to the technique. Despite coming out on top, literally, Jecki's celebration is interrupted by the arrival of Mei's teacher, who immediately opens with solid swings before kicking the Padawan to the curb. Man, I gotta tell you though, because of how long this fight scene has been going on, as well as the fact that they've reused some of the same choreography within the same episode, such as when Qimir spins a lot while dueling Jecki, as well as having a notable lack of battle damage outside of getting kicked and, death. The fight's kinda just dragging along at this point. Considering what happens to half of the cast for this episode, I'm surprised they weren't more liberal with people getting injured before dying. And honestly, that really would have gone a long way in keeping people awake and engaged in the fight. However, I can excuse Jecki's lack of capitalizing on Qimir's openings because the character is meant to be a scrub, despite being played by one of the more talented stunt actors. A clear sign in real life of people who are newer to the whole fighting thing is that they tend to watch their opponent's limbs as opposed to their head or their shoulders or their hips. You see, the idea is that our peripheral vision reacts faster to sudden movement, and you need to let that do all the heavy lifting when it comes to catching incoming attacks. So regardless of if that was intentional or not, I noticed that Jecki was doing that for most of this fight, and it actually leads more credibility to buying the action. Thankfully, I'm jolted wide awake by Jecki's dynamic movements as she springs back into action when Qimir's gauntlet shorts out the Jek saber, and we usher in the next phase of the fight, when the Padawan begins dual wielding. Unfortunately, as much as I love the flowering hands movement from Jecki here, I still think this segment needed another take. I am seriously doubting people actually watch the dailies from this show because it is painfully clear how far away they are from hitting each other. And I'm sorry, but this is pathetic. Girl, you are aiming directly up with those swings. Are you sure you're not the one wearing the sensory deprivation helmet? It's not helped when this second flourish has Qimir holding awkward poses for the sake of blocking, which gives Jecki the opportunity to throw a kick that pushes him back further, and this is the first kick in the show I strongly dislike. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The first one is that the whole advantage of using a kick in a fight is that it's a longer, stronger weapon that is best utilized when thrown at an angle where the opponent can't see it. The problem is that those lightsabers are longer than mine here, and as you can clearly see, even with pointed toes, my blades extend beyond the range of my foot, so there's no real reason for me to be throwing kicks when my weapon will reach. It makes sense when they're kicking unarmed, or when Mei does, because the knives don't reach as far as her legs do. But it's really dumb in these lightsaber duels, and Jecki is extremely lucky that Qimir didn't just hold up one of his weapons and lob her fucking leg off. I will say though that I love how most of Jecki's fighting style with the swords are inspired from Wushu Jian. Those wheeling swords that she's doing are straight out of a Daolu, but unfortunately that's not enough to stop Qimir from severing one of her lightsaber handles and dipping out to go find May. You know, I was going to make a horror movie joke here because every time the camera looks away from Qimir, he vanishes like Jason Voorhees, but that was honestly the point, I think. Well, May eventually gets caught by her teacher, but thankfully she is saved when Sol and Jecki rejoin the fight. I gotta give him full credit here. Even though this exchange is still filled with odd pauses and pointless kicks, that doesn't mean the fight itself doesn't flow well or that it's boring. I think the tempo of the episode has just enough variation in how the fight evolves to pull people back in the moment it feels like it's dragging a bit too long. Plus, if you know about the callbacks they're making to flicks like A Touch of Zen, Hidden Dragon, and Come Drink With Me, then you get a little extra spike of fun until the next change-up. Speaking of that, however, the next time we cut back to the 2v1, Qimir has managed to get both of his opponents in front of him, which not only makes it easier to handle the pair, but also makes the choreography better since there is less of an opening compared to being flanked. I especially love the choice of having the Sith headbutt Sol's blade and short it out here. There needed to be more proactive usage of this technology. It's such a great idea that isn't being fully utilized. Sol temporarily losing his weapon leads to another hand-to-hand exchange, which, I'll be honest, I'm not really a big fan of, mainly because of how poorly framed Qimir's swings are. However, I am still a big fan of keeping Sol consistent in using Aikido techniques. I just can't stay too hyped for too long because even though Jecki and Qimir are totally bringing the energy they need for this fight, the movement choices themselves, on top of the fact that most of these shots are framed so off-center that you can tell their swings are missing by a mile, makes it look like they are actively trying to avoid touching each other. And then that just leads to Jecki getting close enough to bind Qimir's saber down so she can elbow him twice in the mask, which breaks the back of it out. This is a really cool mask, and you don't exactly want to destroy it, but if it needed to break out the back so that the front was damaged and you could reuse it, then why didn't you choreograph it to make sense? Why not just change the choreography to have her smashing the part of it that you want to break off? But then we get to my favorite part of all the choreography in this episode, as we see Qimir disconnect the bottom of his blade to reveal a Shoto lightsaber hidden inside, and uses his main hand to parry an attack while simultaneously stabbing Jecki 3 times in the blink of an eye. He's also hitting a great Kali and Eskrima pose, and I have gotta gush about this for a minute. So the reason why so many martial artists who train weapons complain about how dual wielding is presented in popular media is because of this right here. In real life, not only do you typically use one weapon that's shorter than the other so that they don't get bound up when you're working, you are also meant to use them simultaneously. The thing is, if you keep that in mind, this shit is much harder to choreograph and still maintain that level of coolness. But by sacrificing a character, admittedly way too early for my taste, they were not only able to show some authentic dual wielding, but they also established how powerful and ruthless the character is. Honestly guys, this is the coolest moment in the entire show. From the way it's filmed to the choreography choices and even your story beats. Sincerely, well done guys. Let's continue with another great character-driven moment when Qimir force pulls in May to use as a hostage. Which is not only definitely something this guy would do, but it also calls back to the first episode where May did the same thing in the bar. Then Yord rushes in like he did in episode 2 and force pulls the mask to his hand so he can use it to parry one of Qimir's swipes, and simultaneously shorting out his own saber so that he can break the gauntlet that Qimir's wearing. Stuff like this is really what endears me to a character because it shows me that they are actively learning from previous experiences and applying it going forward. I even like the dialogue that the two share before the next beat, although the only note that I have is I don't understand why Qimir didn't just execute May when he had the chance. The lack of direct action kind of makes the antagonist seem inconsistent in his motives, and if I were writing it, I probably would have established a better reason behind why he doesn't want to just offer right away. After a quick exchange, Qimir ends the bind by rotating out and fucking up a traditional Kali arm break. I'm sorry, but I have to get on to you about this, bro. The arm goes on the outside of the elbow, not the inside. Manny Jacinto is part Filipino, so I'm calling your ass out, dude. And the Santo would roll his eyes at this shit. Anyways, after the arm break, Qimir spins Yord right round and effortlessly breaks his neck. And I just gotta say something about this. Killing both Jecki and Yord in the same episode has pretty much kneecapped the show of all of its interesting supporting cast. And I won't lie to you, I think that was a huge mistake, especially given how the rest of the season plays out. Which segues directly to another mistake, at least in my eyes. Because when the hand-to-hand segment between Sol and Qimir starts, I gotta tell you, at this point in the show, I am sick and tired of watching spinning back fist into cowboy punch. I'm so over it. I'm fairly certain that if we had a little tracker for all of the times they did that in this show, that shit would be in the double digits by now. And by the way, I'm not being hard on this segment just because of the cowboy punches and the spinning back fist, but also because all of the martial arts that these characters use suddenly vanishes. So to everybody who's watched this episode, did anyone else feel like the choreographer was getting just as tired of the fight as we were by the time it got here? Because by this point, it just kind of loses its identity. This was supposed to be the Kung Fu Star Wars, right? I mean, come on, the fight doesn't even end with a dramatic final blow. Instead, they went with the much better idea of having Osha just slap a flashlight onto his back so he gets carried off by the bugs they set up. And now that he's conveniently disposed, the rest of the episode can happen. The final bit of action in the episode is between the two twins. While the two are in the middle of a hug, Osha decides to capitalize and pull her edgier twin sister into an Aikido lock, which is a great homage to Sol, by the way, which May reverses by using a traditional Filipino Kali submission. Let me get hype about that for a second, because one character used a technique from her teacher, which was then answered by the twin, responding with another technique from her own instructor. I gotta give it up to their team. That was incredibly cool to tie those two martial arts across these four characters. Well, it's time to close out the episode by having May force push Osha off of a ledge, I guess, and knock her out, choosing to swap places with her so that she can assassinate Sol. Meanwhile, Qimir stumbles across the unconscious twin and decides to heal her and take her in. So, episode 5 was pretty fucking gas, I'm not gonna lie. Jiao yo to everybody involved. Seriously, a huge step up over the first half of the show. Despite my personal complaints with killing half of the supporting cast and most of the interesting characters way too early, as well as reusing more than a few of the same choreography movements, I think they have established a strong martial identity for all of the major characters in play, as well as maintain consistency throughout them. And with that being said, let's see how the rest of the season goes. Moving on to episode 6, there's not really a whole lot to discuss, except of course for Osha copping a sneak peek at Qimir's 1-inch punch. I see you looking. So dumb. And I guess this part where she holds him up against the wall using the handle of the saber instead of threatening with the blade.
They didn't throw me away.
Then why aren't you a Jedi? Why aren't you a Jedi, Osha?
Because I failed!
Well, you failed at this too, Osha. He's not really in danger if you pin him using the handle, genius. I will admit though, it was a really cool choice to wrap up the episode with just the sound of her breathing. Episode 7 has very little fight choreography as well, but I do want to point out that Mother Ikuetsu Ocha here is doing some really nice Tae Kwon Do inspired bow work. Was that joke too much? Because I feel like it's okay if I say it, since my trick name is Blue Eyes White Devil. I don't know, I'll let Dawn decide if it's worth keeping in.
Yeah, that's staying in.
Moving on, we arrive at the season 1 finale and the first vehicle chase I can talk about. And admittedly, it's pretty damn weak since nothing really happens during the event. May takes a little escape ship into an asteroid belt claiming,
It's too big to follow us in here.
except that he does anyway, and before any conflict can actually take place, the annoying ass piece of merchandise I've been ignoring up to this point chews the wires in Sol's ship, for some reason. which causes his ship to speed up and clip May's, knocking both of them down to the planet. For some reason, instead of just exploding in space. But the episode starts really cooking when Qimir confronts Sol in the ruins of the witch's home. And I just gotta tell you, this is a huge step up over episode 5. And episode 5 was pretty darn good, all things considered. For one thing, because of how cramped all these corridors are, it's hard to set the camera too laterally across from the actors, which not only makes it significantly easier to ensure that the blows are selling better on camera, but also helps sell it to the audience how claustrophobic it is to fight in this space. And then you cap it all off with a lovely balance between the two characters' personalities, as well as a solid blend of practical and flashy techniques. And I want to give a huge shout out to whoever choreographed this moment here when Qimir goes to throw a tornado kick and uses his lightsaber to protect the leg. That was a genius choice. This is a wonderful example of clever choreography choices to help accommodate the kick. As the two make their way to the catwalk, I will note that whoever edited the episode forgot to add CGI to the roofs where they spark, because they're clearly clipping the ceiling here. But in the follow-up shot where we can see down the path behind Qimir, there's no battle damage. And I wouldn't have brought it up except that the entire selling point of this particular beat in the exchange is all of the environmental damage that their fight is causing. When the pair leaps down from the walkway, we get a nice little homage to Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon here. But personally, I wouldn't have played this in slow motion since all it does is kind of interrupt the tempo of the fight, and it makes the exaggerated miss that Qimir does look all the more silly and overdramatic. From here though, it is go time as our Sith lead whips out the backup saber and closes in with Simwali, the most iconic flow drill in all of Filipino martial arts. Dima. It's legitimately the first drill that you learn in Filipino martial arts, or at least in Inosanto school. And wouldn't you know it, this is perfectly punctuated by having Sol incorporate Aikido techniques into his own swordplay. And yes, I'm aware that most Aikido schools also incorporate Japanese swordplay. This all leads to Sol not only disarming Qimir, but also stuffing his attempt to get his weapon back using the Force. While this triple kick here is another moment I personally would have kept at full speed, this next shot is wonderful as Qimir throws both of his sabers and closes in on all sides towards Sol, revealing the canon debut of Force Repulse. That is one power I have been hoping they would draw from the old continuity forever. I'm not exactly sure how I feel about this on a macro scale in regards to the series, but in this particular fight scene, that was fucking awesome. After Qimir rejoins his blades, I'm assuming to have more strength behind his swings to better keep up with Sol, we cut right over to the sisters in the middle of a brawl, and I've been holding something back for a long time that I need to talk about now. The single biggest complaint I have with this show was the decision to have Amanda play both sisters. Because not only do I feel that that objectively weakens the potential chemistry that the two roles will have together, but I just knew that it would affect the choreography too. I have no idea what the general consensus is with Star Wars these days, so I might be in the minority here, but to me, I have not been impressed once with any of the scenes between the two sisters in their adult years, especially in comparison to the scenes that their younger selves shared, since they're played by real-life twin siblings. And in my opinion, I think this fight between the sisters is even weaker than their dialogue ones. We also, for some reason, start dipping heavily into Hunggar and Muay Thai, which would have been fine, except for the fact that neither of them have been fighting like this the entire time. So, if you've been paying attention to the way they've all been fighting this entire season, it comes out of nowhere, especially for May. I mean, I guess Osha can kind of get away with it since she's not really fighting much of the series, but then again, you'd think that she would take after her instructor more and rely heavier on limb manipulation. There is, however, an absolutely fire suicide kip-up that they're using to dodge both a cowboy punch and a back sweep. And man, I just gotta say, whether that's an homage to Bruce Lee in Enter the Dragon or not, that is some really cool choreography. Unfortunately, all of that goodwill is wasted because then they just start mirroring each other like it's some kind of bad anime. I get it, they're also the same person, apparently. Also, spoilers for what is definitely the least interesting part of the show. But I still think that for what's supposed to be the big confrontation between these two, you should have gone the opposite direction of this and showed just how different the two of them really are. And the last thing I'm gonna say about the exchange itself is that it starts to use that horribly stiff 1-1-1-1 fight tempo that I fucking despise. They're literally timed out going hit, 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 like a goddamn metronome or something. And since it's two people played by the same person, at times it feels like this is actually superimposed. It's just gross after everything we've seen so far. And I get the metaphor they're trying to go for here, right? But I'm sorry, it just did not land with me in this exchange. Then the episode commits to the same back and forth gimmick as in episode 5, where we continue to rapidly cut between the two bouts. Popping back in with Qimir and Sol for a brief and admittedly awkward exchange where we're only here to see them respond to more Jedi showing up. Then we are thrown right back to the twin sisters where we get to see everybody's favorite cowboy punch into a duck just so we can watch them respond to the other Jedi showing up. Acolyte creatives, why did you do this? Why not have the sisters react first in the same scene, and then cut to the teacher's response to the Jedi showing up? There are 3 transitions between character perspectives in less than a minute, and for what? Just to see that they see more people are arriving? Did we really need to watch both parties? Thankfully, when we get back to the saber duel, Sol and Qimir continue to bring the heat and progress the fight in a meaningful way. Despite his wild Kikuchiyo-style swordplay, Qimir is steadily getting worn down by Sol's patient efficiency, highlighted by my favorite little touch here with the Jedi casually tilting his head out of harm's way while confidently striding forward. When Qimir grabs Sol's arm here, he is hit with a reversal by the Jedi, fitting considering Sol's proficiencies. In a moment of clear desperation and frustration, the Sith thrust his blade forward, only for the Jedi to evade and use the Force to help push not only the sabers, but also the sparks from their collision towards Qimir's face. Finally, we close out the final duel of the season with a classic samurai clash, resulting in Sol severing Qimir's handle. And with the entire season's catalog of fight scenes thoroughly analyzed and broken down, let's get into my final thoughts. Ultimately, for a show that was heavily advertised and promoted as the kung fu flavor of Star Wars, I think it only ends up being a 3.5 out of 5 or like a 7.5 out of 10. Which is not bad or terrible by any means. Let me make that completely clear here, at least when it comes to action and choreography. This is not what I would call revolutionary, nor do I think they came anywhere close to capitalizing on the idea that they're going for, but I do feel like these fight scenes carry an objectively different vibe compared to the rest of the franchise. There are some characters who have heavily sourced their fighting style from real-world martial arts, such as Jecki and her Wushu Jian, or Sol and his Aikido, and even Qimir and his Filipino Kali / Eskrima. The only problem is that 2/3 of that list are fucking dead now. But to me, the most glaring issue is that our lead, ironically enough, has no sense of identity in a show defined by it. Mei comes across as a generic rogue character from any RPG game, and what's even funnier is sometimes she fucking stands like one too. While Osha is just doing whatever movements the choreographer felt like having a manlet perform that day. So, while I am excited to see what they're choreographing next, that's admittedly because I can see the potential in what they've done here, and not at all because of the execution across the board. Such as not taking advantage of having more battle damage on the characters. You know, for a kung fu inspired show, there is a shocking lack of face punching in it. The other big hurdle that I have with looking forward to Season 2 comes from everything I skipped. While the fights kept me hooked enough, I actually found myself enjoying the dynamics infinitely more than the major plot beats. Serious spoilers ahead, so skip here to avoid them. But they took the worst idea that George Lucas himself shit-canned and made it canon. The twins are virginses in the Force and were created through Force magic with high amounts of power. It's literally the one thing I was hoping this show would not be. It's just another I'm the Special story, which is doubly hilarious considering the movie influences. Most of the media that inspired this is driven by characters that go out of their way to work their asses off for power, sometimes straight up steal it. Not being fated or born with extreme amounts of strength, they completely missed the mark with what defined the Eastern philosophies driving those stories. Also, Plagueis and Yoda are here. Yay! It's just a shame because not only do I think this was a pretty great cast, but I also loved everybody's chemistry with each other, with the exception of the twins for obvious reasons. However, what did you think? Am I being too critical of the show, or did I actually leave something out that makes it worse? And more importantly, what fights would you like us to break down next? Make sure to let us know down below in the comments, please. And as always, if you liked the video, please leave a like, and if you want to see more analysis of martial arts and media, make sure to subscribe. But until next time, I'm bowing out, and I'll see you all in a galaxy far, far away.